we are having a reception in University Club, which is just right across the cement/dirt corner there. And there can be continued discussion from any of the presenters. Other presenters that presented earlier will be coming back to join us and such. So I'll let you get started. Thanks.
I finally remember the name of this thing, like the dais. It took me like a lot. I was like, am I supposed to talk to the dais or like whatever before? I'm Mario. I'm from the Department of Geography here. I'm a grad student. Well, you'll see more or less what I do. So, except that I didn't print out when I was making my transition, so I'll just guess. All right. Every day for the past 17 years, a collective of women in the rural Veracruz community of La Patrona have given food, water, and clothing to migrants riding freight trains north who pass through their community. Comprised of an extended family, their neighbors, and a few friends, they've become somewhat famous in Mexico as Las Patronas. First, in the mid-2000s documentary De Nadie, currently as a source of human interest stories for both state and national newspapers, Televisa and TV Azteca network news programs, and international Spanish-language media like the Bogota-based NTN 24 or NTN 24, and CNN's Spanish-language newscast. And so this is a couple of them. This is Milenio. This is the local newspaper. I'll talk about that, El Universal, in a second. The Patrones are so much like a thing for reporters that not only did the periodical Imagen del Golfo publish an article entitled, and I'll say it in Spanish and then I'll say it in English, Tiene Coatzacoalcos sus propias patronas, that is, Coatzacoalcos has its own patronas, about a group of local women who also give aid to migrants. But indeed, the Patronas Vocera, as they call her, was named by El Universal in Mexico City as one of their 25 reasons to believe in Mexico, which is this up here. I can't quite reach it, but maybe my finger can. That's Norma, the Vocera. What makes the Patronas particularly salient for media coverage is in large part that they give their food, their water, their clothing while the trains are moving. It makes for a great media spectacle. A rotating group of plain, rural, everyday Mexican women who stand dangerously close to oncoming trains as migrants, who are nearly always young men, as you can see in these pictures, hang off the sides to take the bundles the women have tied together. Indeed, the everydayness is perceived as key to their sort of marketability, if you think of it as that. Indeed, while I was in La Patrona in the summer of 2011, for instance, filmmakers decided to shoot a pilot for a documentary TV series titled Héroes Cotidianos, or Everyday Heroes. Now, reporters I've spoken with, the Patronas themselves, and other respondents in Mexico report that over the last decade, Mexico and Mexican culture have seen a general trend in which immigrants, and especially immigrants from Central America, are being humanized to a degree that hasn't been seen in recent times. This is a trend I've only found small traces of in the academic literature, so I want to spend maybe 2 paragraphs talking about it now. While exploitation of migrants throughout Mexico, and especially migrant labor, is still pervasive, what's beginning to change is the social response when this is brought to light. The actor Gael Garcia Bernal, for instance, collaborated in 2010 with an Amnesty International documentary called Los Invisibles, which is about Latin American migrants, so these folks, similar to these folks on the train, who are traveling through Mexico. Included in it is a short interview with the Father Alejandro Soledinde, who, as the head of the Catholic Pastoral Care Network for Migrants, which has about 53 sites, locations where they work, has been instrumental in using his moral authority to shame government officials who mistreat migrants or allow mistreatment to occur. So such a change in mentality comports with the experience of the Patronas. The Patronas report that for the first 10 years of doing their action, that is from 1995 to 2005, they paid for themselves for the food and clothing that they give. Today, however, the food comes mostly from donations. And while the most useful donations are the 50-kilo bags of rice and beans, or bottles of cooking oil, which come in these sort of big, individual things, but in big cardboard trays. The Patronas accept all sorts of gifts from all sorts of people, strangers, near strangers, and friends. With media attention on migration in Mexico has come political attention. On a national level, last year saw the Mexican legislature pass the Ley de Migración, which is supported by both the rightist party, PAN, and the two leftist parties, the PRI and the PRD. The law in many ways decriminalized undocumented migration, especially by Central Americans, though importantly it does not decriminalize working without a valid work visa. And I can talk more about that in question time if you want. Likewise, the Mexican federal government produces a number of materials for migrants, both to inform them of their rights and to give them resources when their rights have been violated. And even further, it runs TV advertisements trumpeting all of these things. So if you watch Mexican TV, or at least the last sort of 6-8 months, you'll see all these like TV commercials that are specifically for migrants who are living in Mexico or traveling through. Thus, the Patrones, as a sort of collective predating the fad, as it were, have become the object less of political attention themselves, as much as the object of attention of politicians. And during the 8 weeks that I stayed in La Patrona, the town, so 6 last summer and then 2 in January, I personally met executive officials at state offices for human rights of Veracruz, for development, and for migration, as well as 2 different federal legislative deputies and people who are some people high up in the office of the governor of Puebla state, which is next door to Veracruz. So those are the heads, more or less, of all of those different departments who just came to show up to say, like, hi, we want to take a picture with you. It's weird. These functionaries and political appointees tend to come bearing gifts or asking what they can make happen for the Patrones. So this paper investigates the politics of one such gift, that of a water purifier donated by the Cordoba Rotary Club. Cordoba is the nearest city to where the Patrones live, and facilitated by the local legislative deputy. As one might expect, even though Rotary paid for the filter, it's the deputy's name that's largest on the sign next to it at the kitchen where there's some migrants. Here's the kitchen. So the sign, it's behind this picture, unfortunately. I don't have a picture of the filter, but it's behind those boxes. And there's a sign on the wall there. This is where they make food. Well, a few months after installation, when I arrived in the summer, the Patrones did not remember exactly how much the purifier cost. They did remember that it was extremely expensive. And I will say that Rotary, a source from Rotary tells me that it cost more than $1,000 US, which is about the third that like a house costs in La Patrona. So you can see, like, that's a lot of money. Importantly, even more than this, rather, even more importantly than that it was expensive, the Patrones recognized that the filter doesn't actually do very much to improve the health of the migrants on the freight trains. So I'll go back to them. You can see, here's some of these guys. Those are migrants. This is not to say that the purifier is mechanically deficient. It's not. In fact, it functions quite well. But questions of epidemiological exposure are more complex than they might seem at first. The water the purifier replaces comes from deep well water. So this is a well. That's really far down, by the way. This is a picture taken down of a well. So the ultimate change in epidemiological risk between migrants between the two sources is extremely low. Even more so, while a fast journey for migrants on the train is about 3 weeks from the Guatemalan border to the US border, a more typical work journey takes 6 to 8. This 6 to 8 weeks, as Sonia Nazario has reported, sort of in the most popular account, is often characterized by migrants drinking from puddles, from troughs, from rivers carrying raw sewage. I'll note here that Nazario's account comports with personal observations in my fieldwork, as well as informal conversations with southbound migrants, so migrants who are going home, who found their way to La Patrona, and with a permanent resident of La Patrona who had taken the train north himself about a decade earlier. So if not to purify water, what's the purifier for? I want to suggest that the primary purpose of the purifier is political. And the remainder of this talk will be to explore the purifier's politicalities. So to start, the Patrones' relationship with the deputy is one that they continually and actively manage. This is the deputy who facilitated, whatever that means, the donation. In addition to her federal duties, the deputy holds a statewide executive job, as is common in Mexico, as the head of the Veracruz State Agency for Migrants. The purifier is not her only gift. Indeed, when I was living in La Patrona, during one such visit, I'll just go back to this picture. I was living in La Patrona during one such visit by the deputy. After a quick inspection of the papeleria, so this is behind a papeleria, like a paper store that one of the Patrones owns, and an inspection of the kitchen and the back storage area, which is, I don't know what direction I'm facing. Well, it's around the corner this way. A photographer in tow the entire time, of course. The deputy asks how she might support, that is, like, dar apoyo, the Patrones. She specifically asked if the Patrones wanted another pickup truck. The Patrones said no, but one collective member talked about her son's trouble getting a driver's license, and then some discussion, as you might ensued between lots of people, at which point another Patrona intervened, changing the subject to the expense of the electricity bill, which I'll get to a little bit later on. The deputy, who had seemed open to sort of intervening in the driver license saga, dodged the issue of the electricity and soon made her way to another appointment. Now, a few days later, the Patrones had a really big argument about the deputy's visit. And the argument was really complex, and so I can't do justice to it in a talk, but it boiled down to sort of three main issues that they were arguing over. First, the question is what they ought to ask for, or ask for, when politicians show up. And typically politicians show up without prompting. Like the deputy in this case, like they had no idea she was going to come. She just like drove up and was like, here I am. Like, who are wanting to know how to help. In other words, what should they say to these people, right? Second, what's the appropriateness of asking for things that only benefit one Patrona, one of the women, who, like the driver license or the electricity bill? And this part of the argument ended up being sort of diverted and digressive into like how you might like organize requests by need, because the Patronas all own sort of different amounts of stuff and are like there's a big wealth disparity between them. So that got derailed and sidetracked, and then like other parts of the argument started. And third, and sort of most importantly for the point I want to make here, they argued about how to protect themselves from politicians. In other words, is there a way to treat gifts from politicians differently without the politicians realizing that they're treating the gifts from politicians differently? One strategy explicitly discussed was to ask for gifts that they would be unlikely to get in order to keep their distance. The Patrona who owns the papeleria claimed that the request for help with the utility bill was partially to protect everyone in this way, many of whom, like, nobody bought it, or like some people bought it, but I don't know if it's true or not. That's what she claimed. The point here is that patronage is well understood by the parties involved. Indeed, the Patronas had a long discussion about the deputy another long discussion about the deputy during my return visit in January. And it's worth noting that the Patronas are not incorporated. They're not an AC. They're not in the Asociación Civil, like an NGO. They're not, in the eyes of the law, anything at all. This has been a deliberate choice and a political one, but they're nevertheless still a group, still a collective. The Patronas understand well that they are in a very difficult spot with the deputy. They both cannot say no to her and risk angering her with a lot of material clout in the balance, both in terms of what she'll bring, what she'll prevent from coming, and again, as the head of the migrant agency for the state of Veracruz. But they also can't say yes without falling into a patronage relationship, a clientelismo relationship with her. So her gifts aren't really gifts. But there's more politics, more material politics in play here as well. As the Patrona who owns the papeleria noted, the electricity bill is quite high, and this is actually directly due to the Purifier. There's a UV lamp that it uses. Recall, too, that the Patronas gave previously, the water that the Patronas previously gave came from well water. So in small part, the Purifier affects an economic alteration. A gift economic practice, that is something that they just give away, right, becomes, with the filter, or with the Purifier, embedded in a network of capitalist relations. Residents of La Patrona, Patronas and otherwise, told me that bypassing the electric meters was a bad idea, and nobody would elaborate more, but I did ask. And so, of social life, the other way of appropriating electricity non-capitalistically, i.e. theft, is not understood as feasible. Thus, water that used to be free, just the cost of lifting it, now costs money, about 300 pesos per 2-month cycle, so that's the increase in the bill, without counting the substantial government electricity subsidy, which is about half of the bill. So the real cost is somewhere around 600 pesos per 2 months. Without speaking to the monetary shift, it's clear that the economic shift is not an accident. There we go. A respondent, the same respondent I was talking about earlier from the Cordoba Rotary Club makes this clear. And he's describing this process of when they give things. He says, we as a club sign an agreement with the schools and all those institutions, universities, homes, in this case he's meaning like orphanages and old people's homes and stuff like that. Places like the Patrones, in which our obligation is to provide the purifier. The obligation of each institution is to do the necessary maintenance, that which follows from proper use. That's the function of the club. It would be impossible that the club has to provision the filters and lamp bulbs, and besides which, it wouldn't be just. We do our part and the school does the other part, for the children, for the students, for the old people in a retirement home. The equation doesn't work if there's not responsibility. It wouldn't be functional. What I'd like to briefly point out here is the work that the discourse does, the discourse that he's using. The words used, and this is true through the whole of the interview, words like obligación, responsabilidad, justo, even ecuación, strongly connect to specific metaphysical views about individuals and individual roles in social life. In short, these comport with individualist notions, and we might go further and say neoliberal or homo economicus notions, of how social life is to occur. Such terms don't work with the Patrones' action, though. Is there responsibility of migrants to take food? Is there an equation to gift giving? Right? These things don't work. The economic change seen here, again, gift economy to capitalist economy, is essentially assumed. It's taken for granted. The economic work of the purifier alters social relations of production. As about the relation of work to labor, the economic is not simply reducible to representation, even admitting that labor is socially constructed and that representation is clearly requisite for ideas of something like money. Okay. So that's a really short empirical part. Now I get to the theory part, which is what I actually do. So hopefully this is clear enough. I want to close this paper by thinking about object politics for a moment. Clearly the purifier is politicized through its use in a political action, that is the Patrones giving to illegal migrants. It's further politicized in its entanglements with the deputy, with the Rotary Club, with capitalism. But the larger question of object politics, as apart from politicized objects, has occupied theoretical attention at least since Heidegger, and more recently, you can talk about McLuhan, and more recently in geography especially, questions of materiality. So there is, of course, the growth of actor network theory, which approaches the question of politicality of objects by rethinking the category of agency, typically proposing a cosmology in which actors becomes an accomplishment of a coalition of actants or actons, depending on how French you want to be with the terms. I don't speak French. I feel weird saying that. And only in concert can the actants affect change. An even more recent working ally to A&T approaches, and perhaps seen in terms of the history of thought as an outgrowth of them, has been Jane Bennett's idea of vibrant matter, in which matter itself is reformulated as a sort of vibrant materialism meant to expand definitions of politics, and she's very explicit that she's trying to expand politics. From the anthropocentric to include formulations in which the capaciousness, and that's her word, of matter carries a political weight. But, and this is where I'm a geographer, even within more traditional meanings for politics, such as Raymond Geiss's sort of very famous formulation, most recently as who does what to whom for whose benefit, we run into questions of, for lack of a better term, scale. How big and how small is whatever we're talking about when we talk about the political? In Discipline and Punish, for instance, Foucault suggests that politics are literally inscribed on human bodies. And Karen Barad does something similar when she talks about piezoelectric crystals and sonograms. Right? This is a different scale to politics than, say, like the historical materialist one, just to give a contrast. And I use it to open, with the description of the purifier thus far, the questions of where the locus of politics lie. Affect theorists, and we like to do that a lot in geography as well, would argue that politics is just as micro as it is macro, that politics lies in force relations often, and that follows from people like Manuel Delanda, that it lies in physical forces between bodies. A purifier, a filter, is by this account always already political in some sense, in the sense that it's like actually blocking some bodies from passing through something. Likewise, when objects as unities are not static but relational, when you start thinking of objects as things not sitting on the wall but are consuming electricity, that are processes, we might provisionally begin to ask how changing materiality, like by consuming electricity and doing stuff, is a form of political action. The goal here is to ground these discussions about materiality and politics, that is, to ground politics in a weird way. Sociality, social life, entails materiality. Materiality is not passive in the sense that it's no medium through which sociality passes. In other words, materiality not only sets the conditions of possibility for social life, but is itself social life. As Bruce Brown and Sarah Watmore, both geographers, have argued, and I quote, "Our embodied relations with things are not something that comes to be added to human life. The human body and its capacities emerge as such in relation to a technicity that precedes and exceeds it. There's no body, no original body, no origin outside this relation, i.e. the relationship between the human body and its capacities through stuff. No thinking, no thought, no logos without that which forces thought." What Brown and Watmore want to claim is that subjectivities are co-constituted with the technologies that we use and build and create as we live every day. Technology, or rather in their formulation technicity, and their formulation is taking off an idea from Derrida, is the bridge between subjects and things, or subjects and matter, or subjects and materiality. The point here is that we can talk about materiality and later objects in social life without falling into determinism or technological determinism. And yet, politics is always relational, and the notion of removing an object, typically to determine that all politics lie with human, is something of a sleight of hand, and that's normally how we think of, like, can objects be political? Take it out, it can't do anything, right? Oh, it's not political. The purifier's economic effect is material. Oh, sorry. Even if this argument is correct, the view has to be much more complex than this. The purifier's economic effect is material, it bears on people, and it seems difficult to parse as fully dead matter, to take Bennett's terminology. What the study of the water filter brings to questions of politics, then, is the location of a technological politics in an affective politics, one of force relations, explicitly recognizing that affective politics plays out an experience even while affect itself is irresolvably and indissolubly material. I'm going to stop there. Thanks, guys.
I'm growing old and reading goes better without glasses by now. That's what I think it's it. Hi, my name is Susanna. Thank you for having me. I'm going to talk about South-South relationships in higher education between Portuguese-speaking African countries and Brazil. And I'm going to present to you the current stage of my dissertation research, the progress of which I'm owing to some extent to the funding provided by LACIS last summer so that I could go and visit some Brazilian universities. I am broadly interested in the role of higher education for development in African countries. I focus on South-South and cooperation between Portuguese-speaking African countries and Brazil. In the first half of my presentation, I introduced the internationally integrated Lusophone Afro-Brazilian University in Brazil, which is, from now on I will call it UNILAB, which will hopefully be the focus side of my dissertation research. And in the second half of my presentation, I discussed the idea of solidarity education as a theoretical concept for the analysis of UNILAB. This concept refers to a particular mode of international cooperation in education between Southern and Eastern partners. And embedded in the discussion, I will present 4 schools as historical examples of solidarity education. Why am I interested in UNILAB? Most scholarly work and political discourse around the development in African countries focuses on the failure and the impossibilities of the effort. There is a paucity of careful examinations of development practices that may serve as sites of possibilities. That is, situations, policies, and places where things seem to lean towards solutions rather than failure. I want to study UNILAB as one such site of possibilities. Brazil's role in the world has been changing due to its economic growth and its declining dependence on aid regimes since it paid off its debt with the IMF in 2006. Thus, Brazil continues to position itself as South-South partner for African countries. During the presidency of Lula da Silva from 2002 to 2010, Brazil has made tremendous efforts to strengthen ties with African countries in economic, diplomatic, and social matters. One of Lula's first acts of office was a federal decree that made the study of African history and African and Afro-Brazilian culture mandatory at all levels of Brazilian education. The founding of UNILAB is further rooted in the community of Portuguese-speaking countries, which was initiated in 1989 under the auspices of Brazilian President Sarney. The community aims at a political and diplomatic coordination between its member states, the cooperation in all fields, which ranges from health and education to public security and sports and media and anything in between, and the dissemination of the Portuguese language. The governing principles of equal sovereignty of member states, non-interference in internal affairs, respect for their national identity, reciprocal treatment, primacy of peace, democracy, rule of law, human rights and social justice, respect for territorial integrity, promotion of development, and promotion of mutually advantaged cooperation guide the community. In reference to the idea of integration, cooperation, and solidarity, Lula proclaimed that no other subject matter has the ability to unite and transform a country as education does. UNILAB was born based on the principle of solidarity. UNILAB wants to develop
words. We are having a reception in University Club, which is just right across the cement/dirt corner there. And there can be continued discussion from any of the presenters. Other presenters that presented earlier will be coming back to join us and such. So I'll let you get started. Thanks.
I finally remember the name of this thing, like the dais. It took me like a lot. I was like, am I supposed to talk to the dais or like whatever before? I'm Mario. I'm from the Department of Geography here. I'm a grad student. Well, you'll see more or less what I do. So, except that I didn't print out when I was making my transition, so I'll just guess. All right. Every day for the past 17 years, a collective of women in the rural Veracruz community of La Patrona have given food, water, and clothing to migrants riding freight trains north who pass through their community. Comprised of an extended family, their neighbors, and a few friends, they've become somewhat famous in Mexico as Las Patronas. First, in the mid-2000s documentary De Nadie, currently as a source of human interest stories for both state and national newspapers. Coatzacoalcos has its own Patronas, about a group of local women who also give aid to migrants. But indeed, the Patronas Vocera, as they call her, was named by El Universal in Mexico City as one of their 25 reasons to believe in Mexico, which is this up here. I can't quite reach it, but maybe my finger can. That's Norma, the Vocera. What makes the Patronas particularly salient for media coverage is in large part that they give their food, their water, their clothing while the trains are moving. It makes for a great media purse. Televisa and TV Azteca network news programs, and international Spanish-language media like the Bogota-based NTN 24 or NTN 24, and CNN's Spanish-language newscast. And so this is a couple of them. This is Milenio. This is the local newspaper. I'll talk about that, El Universal, in a second. The Patronos are so much like a thing for reporters that not only did the periodical Imagen del Golfo publish an article entitled, and I'll say it in Spanish and then I'll say it in English, Tiene Coatzacoalcos sus propias patronas, that is, Coatzacoalcos is spectacle. A rotating group of plain, rural, everyday Mexican women who stand dangerously close to oncoming trains as migrants, who are nearly always young men, as you can see in these pictures, hang off the sides to take the bundles the women have tied together. Indeed, the everydayness is perceived as key to their sort of marketability, if you think of it as that. Indeed, while I was in La Patrona in the summer of 2011, for instance, filmmakers decided to shoot a pilot for a documentary TV series titled Héroes Cotidianos, or Everyday Heroes. Now, reporters I've spoken with, the Patrones themselves, and other